Christopher, it's really, really exciting to be here and to kind of see a little bit of your studio in the background. Um, I'll let you introduce yourself and a bit of your work.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks for having me on here. I love having these conversations with other creatives, and I feel like we have a lot in common to chat about. So, yeah, a little bit about me. So, I'm a full-time professional oil painter. I describe my work as mythological realism, and it's generally large-scale, figurative, narrative painting that focuses primarily on myth and but not myth as like most people would think about it in terms of sort of more of the fantasy myth of Greek mythology or these kind of classical renditions of it, but more as like myth as like a way of how we perceive the world and ourselves. And then in addition to that, I also run an online academy where I help artists, primarily painters, focus on how to develop their vision and their process as artists and to create discipline and structure around that. And that too is using this structure and this lens of myth making in our lives and like what's the myth that we are all living into as individuals in the world. So yeah.
That's great. I was really drawn into your work, and I think it's got that depth of like there's so many different stories in each piece. Um, would you, I mean, when you talk about the myth, like what got you into kind of creating in that way? Because I know that you've got a very classical kind of background. Um,
Hmm.
did that progress over time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I first was exploring being an artist, it was pretty young, I mean, just out of high school, I was like, this is what I want to do. And I was kind of one foot in for quite a while, for actually the better part of a decade, where I was like practicing and I was just experimenting and playing around with different styles and different techniques and not really sure. I think I was at the beginning, I was just kind of in love with the romantic notion of being an artist and the lifestyle of what it was like. And but then when I actually got serious about it, I was asking myself some questions like, well, what kind of art am I in love with? Like what made me fall in love with painting in the first place? And that drew me into a lot of like kind of like classic Renaissance style paintings and primarily like Caravaggio and Rembrandt and kind of the more dark, dramatic chiaroscuro type of compositions and narratives. And I always loved the figure and I always loved storytelling. And so, luckily, at that point in my development as an artist, like ateliers started becoming a really big thing all around the United States and all around the world, which is essentially it's like classical approach to drawing and painting. And it's like it's a very specific type of training for that. And so then I went down that route to develop my skills, and then slowly over that time, my my vision for myself was like building, which was like, what did I want to say with that? And I knew that that had to be something that was like very personal to me. And so that came over years of developing in a very particular direction.
Yeah,
And we
that's
can go into whatever direction you want there, but
um what have you found? Because when we first spoke, I remember you saying that you had explored at some point going out in nature. You did this with a friend and like guiding people in nature.
mhm.
Was that part of teaching people like a creative process, or was that completely unrelated to your practice as an artist?
It started out as my own personal practice, and then that evolved into, I mean, I just threw my own like powerful like evolution through that process. I was like, wow, this is actually, there's something here that I think is really potent, not just for artists, but just for people in general. But I grew up in a pretty rural area living in the woods, and I always had like a relationship with being in nature. And I was a pretty solitary person when I was young. And so like one of my favorite things was just to like go on long walks in the woods and get lost for like, most of the day when I could. And so And then this practice sort of came about much later, and it was something that helped like catalyze my process as an artist that I had already kind of figured out, but this was really like what brought it all together and gave it a lot more meaning. And that started probably about 5 years ago. I had already had I would already go out into nature, go for long walks in the woods, and just to essentially get inspired, to give myself space to get inspired. But then this new practice emerged that was like had much more intention to it, which is this practice that we call wandering. And it was partly inspired by the work of Bill Plotkin, who wrote a book called Soulcraft and many others. And he's the founder of the Animus Valley Institute. And essentially, that's just teaching people how to, it's like rites of passage and vision quests and vision fasts and these like group retreats out into nature to essentially find the wild one inside of you, right? And that can go off in a lot of different shoots through the programs that they offer. But for me specifically, that evolved as specifically towards creativity.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, so I work with creatives as well, and one of the things that I always always come across artists who tell me like I'm finding that, they talk about artist block. Honestly, I don't
Hmm.
believe it's a thing. I know that some people experience it, but it's not actually a thing. Like your creativity is never blocked. You're just in your head. And I
Yeah.
think you are creative, and everyone is creative, right? But some people are specifically meant to use their creativity throughout their lives. I know,
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
example, like my husband's an engineer. He's very like analytical and he's got a creative side, but I'm very strategic, but I'm more creative than anything else. And so if I'm doing all of the strategy and all of the things that make sense to my mind, I'll get blocked. But all I need to do is go out in nature and just breathe and reconnect to my body. And then inspiration is everywhere. So I really
Hmm.
love all of those different practices where people kind of like guide us out and just remind you that, sometimes there's also that discipline aspect, right, that you talk about where, if you're not inspired, like, are you actually making time for that creativity to come and find you? Or are you just telling yourself you're not inspired and like getting busy doing all the other things? Um,
Right.
I was reading something recently. This guy was talking about how how back in the day, so I grew up in France and there were so many different artists who different eras that always talked about this muse. And sometimes they personified this muse, but he was talking about it in the sense of like, much broader sense of just inspiration. But he was a very down to earth, very unspiritual type person. But he said, when I sit down to create, I have a ritual to the muse, because it's like, if there is this muse and I really believe that there is something, like whatever you want to call it, that works through you, then I'm going to make sure that I have a good relationship with that. And I feel that
Hmm.
that's something that we forget when we create something, and we create something that's, that we love, that's beautiful, that we get lost in the process. And then when that one particular project is over, we can kind of be in this limbo of like, well, when's the next one coming? But I feel like
Hmm.
people don't actually sit down and create the discipline and the practice and the strategy around making that happen, right? Like they're kind of passive
Hmm.
in that practice. Um,
Yeah. Oh man, I couldn't agree more. I mean, a lot of points there. I wholeheartedly agree with you that I don't believe in an artist block, or it's that artist block generally is just because people aren't tapped into a process or a ritual or a way of how they've been cultivating relationship with their creative capacity. It's generally, and I think this is in part due to this like old paradigm of this picture that's been painted about what it means to be an artist in the world, that it essentially at any point in any time we can just essentially put our hand up and be like, I'm an artist. And like, there you go. And then the whole world's just going to open up for you. And it's not this thing that you have to practice and cultivate and like work towards developing in yourself, just like anything else. And I'll bet that it operates differently than, say, like you were saying, if you're like, having to sit down and work on the business or do these other things. It's just another way in how we engage, right? I think with creativity, it's about cultivating our like intuition and our and this other capacity from ourselves that I believe come from this like unconscious realm. The creative unconscious is like Carl Jung would talk about, and things like going and giving your self space to walk in the woods, or to do like automatic writing or automatic drawing, or like, there's so many different like active imagination practices or deep visioning work where we just allow ourselves to just be playful in that creative space, and to do that over and over again. And then we find how we show up in that space in our own authentic and unique way. But it's a thing that we need to spend time cultivating. And then boom, it's like this whole world, this whole universe opens to us when we do that. And so yeah, I think that also dovetails into discipline and structure, and like how we like manage our time of like, this is time for being creative and like wild and active and playful, and this is time for like, filling out my spreadsheets and like doing business, and so it's
Boring
just a
stuff that's
matter of,
necessary.
yeah, totally. But and again, to your point, I think, there's a difference between, I think, being an artist and being creative. I yeah, I'm a long time um practitioner of like Vipassana meditation. It's been a part of my life for the last 20 plus years. And I started seeing these like overlaps in the way that I thought about or what creativity meant to me. And this that was similar to, I think what a lot of people are seeking in the contemplative arts, which is to find this like oneness to everything, this sort of this drop of the self and this drop of separation from everything in our existence, oversimplifying it here, of course. But that, like, when I think about, like, if I ask myself the question, what does it mean to be completely authentic in my creative expression? That to me is exactly the same as like finding myself in this state of like samadhi or nirvana or whatever you want to call it, where you feel at one with all things and you feel unbridled in your expression of who you are, or of the divine, or whatever that is, that. And when we're in that flow, like, that's when our truest self, which I think is our true, which is creative, is just wanting to expand into that.
Yeah, I think the opposite spectrum of, when people are completely suppressed, traumatized, like in that state of, just kind of doing life like everybody else does it, and not being their true selves. The opposite of that is expression, you know.
Hmm.
But so for me, like a few years ago, my background was, I was an interior designer. And then I started a creative business when my son was born, because I felt like there was a part of me that was like, well, it's now or never. I've finally got the time, and I'm like, here, I'm bored. I've got this baby. Like, I'm going to start getting back into art and making it something, of my daily practice. But then I think my strategic mind took over and was like, well, how do I actually make this into a business that's, profitable, that can support my family and do all these things? And there was like this push and pull of, what do I do for the market, but what do I do that's fun? And I think that for me, there was this deep sense of like, it was just healing to be in my workshop. And I started off creating pieces for family homes. So, as an interior designer, I started doing like interior pieces. So I made these wooden height charts where people could chart the heights of their kids growing up. So, and it was a piece that they would keep forever, because I moved around a lot. So I saw how practical that was. Like, to just,
Hmm.
my tagline for a while was less things, more meaning. And so I made all these,
Hmm.
I made baby blocks, and I would paint them, and I would sit literally for hours after my kids had, well, my baby had gone to bed, and I would just paint these little blocks. And just being in that state was just that pause that I needed. Like, some people would go on a yoga retreat or something like that. I just sat in my studio and painted my little blocks. But I got into that flow state, and I was able to kind of just be there and realize that that's actually, and I know this is not the case for everybody, but for me, flow state is actually my very natural state. I became a
Hmm.
hypnotherapist later on because it just made so much sense to me to be able to guide people into that state, because that's where you're able to just see everything clearly. You're able to like not like just release that attachment to everything needing to be a certain way and just come into that state of presence. And I remember a few years down the line, like I had to kind of sway between being an artist and being a healer, and having all of my mentors telling me that I was a healer, but then realizing that actually I've always only ever wanted to be an artist. And for me, they're actually the same thing. It's working with the same
Hmm.
energy, essentially.
Hmm.
And I had this moment of just painting. And I remember the first time I picked up a palette knife. So I'd painted all kinds of different things. My form of art was drawing, but I picked up this palette knife and started moving paint around with it. And I felt like my heart just expanded beyond my chest, beyond my body, beyond my house. And I just had this inner voice that said, why have I ever done anything else in this life? And I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
well, that's a pretty clear sign that you need to do more of whatever it is that you're doing right there and then. If it's, not something that's, let's say, destructive drug abuse or something that gives you that big sensation. Yeah, I think that was this moment where I just stopped and went, whoa, okay, so that was intense. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that sometimes there's a lot of people who have fallen into this old story that artists have to suffer for their art, or it has to be hard, and they have to go into deep depressions to be able to pull out. Um,
Hmm.
it's kind of like that. The
Or that like artists have to wait for inspiration to strike, right? It's
Yeah,
like
they have
both
to
things,
sit
right?
there
And
and
so then they're
suffer.
just like sitting there suffering, wondering like why the muse isn't hitting.
Yeah.
It's like the worst combination.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an outdated story. And yet I still find that in some people when they know they're creative, but there's this feeling of like, oh, I need to go into my pain and draw it out. And I think that, I mean, obviously the healing process is very important, but I don't think that creativity comes from pain. I think the pain is what's stopping us from actually accessing it, but it's not the source of it. Have you found that when you work with creatives that they have that, I guess that
Yeah, I
masking
do
of
think there
identity?
is there is like a limiting belief that comes in that I think comes from a lot of different directions. It either comes from the things that we're hearing kind of culturally out in the world, or it comes from, you know, but yeah, I think ultimately it's there because it comes there, and then it's either, our caretakers were informed in that way, and then they're then reflecting that to how they raise us, and they're like, oh, well, this isn't a reputable career, or you're never going to make any money, or they instilled these beliefs into us as children. I mean, that's one way of it. And, I think that again, kind of back to that thing of like, what does it mean to be truly authentic in our creative expression? The other thing that comes up when that question is posed is also like, what's keeping me from being that? And then all of a sudden, all of these things come up of like this fear of being vulnerable, and this fear of like putting myself out in the world and like and sharing these things. And what if I'm rejected and all? And so there's all this stuff that's like tied up in that. And but I do think that like the best way to ameliorate that is it's like exposure therapy, is like to just go in and just start allowing yourself to be playful in that space and to create and to imagine and to like get back into that childlike open wide-eyed wonder and like, what can I become? What is this? And like you were saying, and then you tap into this part of yourself that it's really quite magical. And I have always considered myself someone that's very like, I think you were talking about your friend or your father, that's very like kind of down to earth, like more pragmatic and practical in the way that I think about my relationship to things in the world. But I kept on having these experiences that felt like magic when I leaned into these practices, that I would be surprised. I'd be like, holy smokes, like, my friend and I, we call it the mystery. And it presents itself, and we've agreed that just to keep on trusting the mystery and following it and to see where it goes. And it's taken me into becoming a full-time career artist, and it's taken me into doing work on my terms, what I want, and that being successful and that being fruitful, and like not listening to what other people are telling me that I need to follow trends and like do this and do that and da 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 da. And 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 in terms of kind of back to your question of like these sort of patterns that I'm seeing and artists that I work with, is that I think so much of it comes from like we're unconscious to it. Yeah, and I think that when we're just sort of acting out these things that for the like most of the time we're not aware what we're acting out, or that like this thing that's embedded in us. And I think in part our art can help bring that out if if we're intentional about it. And that's a big part of what I do in how I work with artists is I first get them to like tap into these relationships that they have with themselves from like an archetypal stance and like these aspects of their psyche and where these things are embedded, and then to learn how to express those through their art form so that they can like actually come into relationship with it in a way that's really productive and like expressive, you know, until like it gets it moving and it makes you conscious of it so that you can work with it with intention.
I really love your use of archetypes and how you share on that. How do you, so I remember you shared um, that you had specific archetypes that you worked with for yourself. How do you
Mhm.
another figure out what that is for them?
Right. So in terms of figuring out for them, and the reason I like or that I think archetypes are so powerful is because they're like universally relatable,
Yeah.
right? Like for the most part, you can, you know, I mean, there's all these subsets of archetypes. There's like the Jungian archetypes, but then there's like, I mean, essentially anything can be an archetype. It's just based on like association to a thing. And I think it's a really powerful and like simple way to make an association to something that's highly complex in yourself and then put it into a symbol that you can then like be like, oh, this represents this part of myself. And whether it's a negative or a positive, or as I say, a creative or a destructive element, then we can work with it because it's like it's there, it's tangible, it's a thing that we can now like interact with. And sorry, remind me again the question. I kind of
No, how you
just
how you would guide someone to figure out what archetypes are relevant
oh
to them.
right. Yeah. Okay. And so what we do is then we look at these different aspects of our psyche from like our relationship to our family and to our ancestry and to our culture and assign those parts of our lives an archetypal relationship, right? And then from that we can extract like behaviors and characteristics that show up in our life. And this is in part influenced by Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell in a way of like how we think of like myth as like a psychotechnology. It's like a tool that we can use to like operate just in the same as archetypes. They're tools we can use to create greater understanding for ourselves. And so for instance, if I think about like my relationship to my culture and I assign it an archetype that makes sense to me, and then the behaviors and characteristics that like go into why I chose that archetype, and then I can understand or like, well, these are aspects of that I think about this that are actually creative and productive. They influence the way that my narratives take form in my art, or they can take shape in like how I show up in my studio practice in terms of my discipline or this or that. And then they'll also show me the destructive side, if there is one. Like maybe I'm really like obsessive about these things and I like have like analysis paralysis around things. And so it shows me all of these different ways that these show up in my life. And it's no longer this unconscious thing. Now it's like I'm like aware of it, and then I can actually the aspects of it that are destructive, I can work on reframing them to where I can like actually come into right relationship with them. I don't get rid of them, but say it's like a quality that's like I was saying before, it's like I have like this obsessive quality that nothing's ever quite right. Well, that also leads to me creating work that I'm really proud of. And then it gives me that awareness that I need to kind of keep that in check and be like, oh, well, I need to like make sure that what are some productive ways that I can move away from the more destructive and more towards the positive side of that.
Yeah.
And so going through this exercise, they come out of this with an understanding of all of the ways that these are influencing the way they show up as a creative, from like the type of work they want to create to what they want to say in their work to how they show up and make their work and their practice and their routines. And then they can actually start to, what I have them do is actually build a personal myth. It's not like some external myth like Hercules or Aphrodite or Zeus or what. It's like what is like what do you call your mythopoetic identity? What is this identity that you are like that you are living into, and what is the most fulfilled expression of that identity? And that's your journey as an artist, is to like live into that as best that you can.
Yeah. That's really
And
interesting. I
yeah.
work with clients in a very similar way, but I'll what I actually perceive of people intuitively is the different parts of them, or that's what I call it. But it's like we have all of these inner identities, and I actually, if I'm doing a healing session with someone, I'll be able to perceive the different parts of them that are like pretty much like an inner archetype, but that aren't been given a voice. And so if someone's being very serious, there could be a part of them that's really funny and playful, and but they've never been given a voice or a seat at the table. They've never been listened to.
Hmm.
So I help them understand that that part of you has, it has these gifts as well that you don't get to access if you're not giving them a seat at the table. And one visualization that I recently guided a client through was to, because she's a businesswoman, and I was like, well, imagine that you're around a board table. You're in this boardroom and you're inviting in these different parts of you, and you get to all discuss all of the problems that you have and find solutions together. And it's quite interesting to do practices like this because people start to embody more of themselves. And so I
Hmm.
find that
Hmm.
part of your creative practice is not necessarily just sitting in your studio with your materials, but also, dancing or cooking yourself a meal before that, but really embodying those parts of you that nourish yourself, that connect to yourself, and then give you access to all of these inner assets that you have, but you're not taking
Hmm.
advantage of if you're not acknowledging that they're there. And
Hmm. Hmm.
I think that makes us a lot more powerful as creatives. And also, well, obviously, it helps with inspiration because we've got access to a larger kind of um, scope of perspective. That's really fun.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. There's something that came up in there that reminded me of a distinction that I think is sometimes important. I mean, we all show up to the like our process of how we are actually making things. And I know for me, it's different. Again, back to that idea of like this sort of like romantic notion of how artists work, right? It's like for me when I was growing up, it was like this visual of like this crazy chaotic studio with like canvases stacked everywhere and like paint all over the walls, and like the artist would just show up to a blank canvas and just like start with no idea and then would walk away with like a masterpiece maybe. And it was like this very kind of like magical thing. But the reality of it, I mean, and this is different for everyone obviously, is that it's very strategic and meticulous for me. Like I plan out and I do studies and I hire models and I like go through this very in-depth design process. So by the time that I actually start painting, um, there's not there's the playfulness happens in like how I get nuance with the expression of the paint, but like the subject is completely figured out already. And that for me, like the like 90% of the creative process happens before I actually even paint. And it's all in the exploration of the idea. It's in the design. It's in the like, how do I want to tell this story? And like, how do I want to play around with all of these compositional elements? And then over time, it's like and I think this is important for a lot of artists, is that like there's a distinction between the craft and the art, right? Like, and I think this is, I mean, this was actually one of the main reasons why I actually started my program, is because I saw this trend. I mean, especially coming out of ateliers where it's like a focus on like very in-depth observational skills to like to paint and draw realistically. And there's a range of what realistic means, obviously, of like hyper-realism to like expressionist realism to all everything in between. But that there was like all of a sudden everything was on the importance of the craft. It was all about like how amazing can I like make render this thing to look a certain way. And to me, I was like, there's not art in that. Like there's practice in that, and there's a lot of value to be extracted
Still,
from that. But like there's no like the art aspect of it was being lost, and then on social media and everyone in the world, it's like between that and the commodification of art, it was like this is like some perversion of what art used to be, and we're losing touch with that. And so it's like, how do we get back into like infusing the craft and infusing that process with something that feels really alive and rich? And like I said, for me, it's like I have a very distinct practice that's around cultivating and generating these ideas that in some sense is partly separate from the craft of it. It's still alive when I'm making the paintings, but it's definitely like towards the end of the process or the arc of that process.
I find that so interesting because I have a very different process. So when it
Hmm.
comes to painting, like mostly what I'm doing at the moment is I'm creating these, I'm calling them higher self portraits because that's the only way I can explain it. And it started out because when I work with a client over a long period of time, and I don't necessarily focus on helping them with creativity or with art, but it was more just a healing process. But people would
Hmm.
come to me
Yep.
for that transformation, and what they would always get out of it is that they would expand their creativity tenfold. They would always remember that they wanted to, create a particular project, and it was often, they're creative people, but they're locked into a world that doesn't allow them to express that. And so it was interesting for me. It was like, I think I'm meant to be working with most only creatives. Like I stopped working with
Hmm.
the lawyers and the burnt out, you know, accountants and just focused on creatives. But what I found is that I wanted to show people how I see them. And when you see someone, when you see really what they're capable of, when you see, it's really that people are magnificent, but they don't perceive that of themselves. They see themselves as their kind of identity, their name, their profession, their habits, and all of that.
Hmm.
So I wanted to kind of like show them, in a way, it's like if you take someone and you get them, you put them through makeup, hairstyling, and do a photo shoot, and you're just like, but it's not showing them like a kind of a fake glossed over version of them. It's just like the radiance that's within. But I
Yeah.
found that with that process, I'd kind of start by doing a portrait of them. But then there were all of these elements that would come in that I couldn't predict initially and that I didn't see initially. Like sometimes I'd get this idea and I kind of like I can picture it and I try and like I sketch it out and I work with the idea and I guess similar to what you do, but not to that extent. But it's often when I'm in the creative process that everything kind of comes into place. And in a
Hmm.
way that
Hmm.
I've really learnt with everything that I do that I can plan it however meticulously I can. And I used to do this when I did, when I would plan events or when I would do anything that was related to like the healing/creativity work. And when I actually got into flow and when I got really present, it would take a completely different tangent. And I had to be okay with letting go of what I'd planned. So
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
really long time, I'd continue doing the planning because I felt, well, if someone is hiring me to come and do this thing, or if they're, paying money to come to my event, I need to be prepared. I need to know and I have to have all of this. Like I felt like that's how I add value. Like that's how I need to be prepared. But then it would completely go on a tangent and be completely different and be better probably than what I'd planned. But it was very present and in the moment. And I feel like that's what my art is as well. Like I get this vague vision of what I want to create. Like this piece that I created here, I had that in my mind for ages. But I remember at the time when I first saw it, I had no idea what it was made out of. I didn't have the technical skills to do it. And so I spent a few years just working with the different materials and getting to know them. I worked with rope and cotton and different things, and then ended up only working with wool because of the frequency of it and how it makes people feel. But that was years of a practice of learning how to use this particular material, because this thing, my heart and my soul want to create this thing, and I, as a human, I don't have the skills yet, but I can practice those skills.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that was very much a
That,
very vague idea. And then
well, I think you bring up a really good point there, in terms of that. Like, I think actually there's way more similarities in like how we show up to our creative process than not. It's just like where that happens at what like arc of the creation of the thing. But it's, you know, there's this thing that always stuck with me. I think it was from the book called Mastery by Robert Greene, where he talks about, and that like paired up with like the book about flow and like how we essentially are able to like our cognitive function when we are like learning versus creating like something novel, for instance, and that like there's this period of time where we're like learning technical skills, and we have very little room cognitively to actually expand beyond that. It's like we first have to learn how to internalize the mechanics and all of these things that go into like the making of the thing, right? Before we could really kind of like go off and extend into these like very new exciting ways. And so a lot of that then that is again how I work with students is like get them to engage in like studies and like wild like sketching and just like being playful in this space that's full of experimentation, so that then they're like getting a taste of like, oh, this, I like this direction. I want to take that and then like implement that into like the paintings or the creations that I want, and doing all of these studies. So then when they do get into like creating like a final work of art, they have the confidence and they have like this skill set that they've developed that then allows them to have that space to be more playful and like and feel like they can take things in a way that feels, I guess, a little bit more known to them.
mm,
But I can see, I mean, with something like your work behind you, like there's so much space there, I think, to like for playfulness, I mean, it like just looking at like the nature of it, it feels very playful. And so and I think it's just the nuance of like, say for instance, like this piece that I'm working on behind me, which is kind of intense. It's a commission that I'm working on. And like the playfulness for me that happens in that is like where I push color, or where I'm like, I'm gonna just like take a palette knife and gob on like a crazy amount of texture, and then just like play with glazes to see how like much I can make this thing look like it's glowing light, and like that's like I kind of get into this like mad scientist
yeah.
like mode in my head where I'm just like really kind of having fun in that space. And I have the room to do that because I like the rest of it has already been kind of set, and I can play within the parameters of that world that I created for myself.
Mm. And how does that work when you set out to do a commission? Because I've found that I'll get commissions for my portraits, because people like they want a portrait of themselves, and they're a little bit kind of, I don't know. There's always different elements. It's not just a watercolor portrait of a face. There's other elements that kind of play into it, and they're always curious to see what happens there. And they give me full creative license to just go with it, because
Yeah.
those are my terms and conditions. It's like you can't tell me that I need to paint you with like a wolf head on the side of your head or something like that. It's like whatever comes through is going to come through. But I always find that for me, in order for me to create in the way that feels authentic to me, I'll just ask a client, say if they want a wall piece, it's like, give me the size that you want and then tell me if there's a couple of pieces that I've done that you like something about, but I'm not going to design every element of it and get you to approve it. It's like, you need to trust the process. And I've found that people really go with that.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that that's a lot more difficult to do with painting, right? Do people come to you with a very specific idea?
It ranges. Yeah, sometimes it is. Sometimes it is very specific, but even within that specificity, it's like there's an understanding. They're like, yeah, and I sometimes have to remind them. It's like, well, you reached out to me because you see this work that I create. Why would you want me to create something that's different from the work that I create? Like, you should go find an artist that's doing that work, you know? And like, and I tell this to students a lot, is, you know, that are getting into working professionally, and they're like, oh, I just get like these pet portraits and like these silly commissions, and it's not at all what I want to do, but I need to do it to make money. And you know, and it's this hard thing when we start mixing making money with our creative process and vision. It's like it creates some tension sometimes. But you need to, you know, for me, it's like standing firm of like, this is the kind of art that I create as an artist, and like let's stick within that field, right? But for the most part, most people that I work with, they understand that. And I give a little bit of flexibility within like their creative input. And that's one of the things I ask them in the beginning is like, how much input are you comfortable with giving? And like, how much do you want to be in the driver's seat of this? And so I just kind of manage those expectations early on. Um, but you know, like for instance, I did like a painting. I think this is one of the more specific ones. If someone came to me and they're like, "Oh, I want a painting about Persephone, the myth of Persephone," and then and that like I want there to be Cerberus needs to be in the painting as well. Cerberus was like her three-headed like dog, and like beyond that, like it was that was about it. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm going to design something, and then we do like a back and forth where I'll like design kind of a broad composition and like discuss the elements and how that's going to go, and then there'll be like a little bit of feedback, but for the most part they kind of trust in that. The general way that it works though is someone will just give me kind of a prompt of like a a big picture kind of theme, and then let me kind of run with it. And then sometimes there's like maybe that goes through maybe two or three iterations of like I'll give them some options and they'll be like, oh, I like that one. And then we just kind of dive down a particular route.
And so how long does that
But
creative process take for you? You know, no, it's like how long
yeah,
string, but
yeah, I mean it depends, you know. I mean it totally depends on the piece. You know, for like I would say in general, it's like back and forth for like about a month, maybe, you know, and that's like, and that's not like every day for a month. That's just like kind of, you know, me going through my initial design phase, and then we have like a little bit of back and forth over a few weeks, and then land on a design that we're really happy with, and then move forward. And that's like, it depends, you know, like some of my pieces, you know, personally too, is it's just like I like fall in love with like a pose, like because I'm very driven to like figures end up being like the main center point of what pieces are designed around for me, because I'm like really into like rhythms and lines and shape, like kind of the abstract design of how figures interact with each other. And like that sometimes that's like an overnight, like I come up with a design that I really love and I kind of sketch it out and play with it, and then I hire models and go for it. But like another example here, I'm going to walk you over here so we can kind of see this backdrop here. Um, so there's this piece here, which you may be seeing, this big one that I'm working on, and this is very much in process. Like all the orange is like still yet to be painted. And like this took me like 3 months, maybe more of design. And so that like is much more involved. There's like a deeper narrative there. And these are kind of like, this is like the main work that I do is like very large scale multi-figure pieces.
mhm.
And you know, that's a lot of like multiple sessions of working with individual models and bringing them in and like doing costume design and like special lighting and just like really it's like a whole production with pieces like
Yeah.
that. And I love, love, love. I mean, that's like one of my favorite parts, like I was saying, is just like the early stages of getting into like how much fun I have, like working with models and like finding like the cool outfits and playing with color and environment. And like I'll go out into the woods and get references and like kind of imagine all of these different ways of telling the story. And that's to me, it's so much fun.
Yeah, and it really shows. I think that's the kind of piece that you could just sit there and spend a few hours staring at and getting all the details and the so many different layers of that story. I'm
Hmm.
just amazed on how you can capture light in that way. Like it really glows. It's amazing.
It actually, it's an obsession of mine, like trying to figure out light, and I was given a nickname. This was a long time ago. This was kind of when I was like doing art in like the festival scene and like touring around, and I was also a builder. Anyway, and so I would build these like cool chandeliers that would illuminate these spaces and stages and things like that. And I was given the nickname Lighthouse. And that like really like it that amongst other it just became this part of like that mythopoetic identity for me that I started to like really live into. And so like light became kind of the center focus of my art. And both from a place of like symbolic and also composition. And like so with that, like I'm also playing around with materials to actually create physical illumination, like the way that like so I put like these specific types of medium in with the paint. Like one is like crushed leaded glass that I mix in with the white so that when actual light hits the painting, it has like a much more intense reflective quality and
Yeah.
and actually reflective quality in low light situations. So some of my paintings, I have this painting called Threshold, that like when the light's really low, I painted candles in it, and it looks like the candles are like light. You can see them across the room, even like in a low lit room. And so I'm always like I really love it. It's just something I like. I'm always kind of pushing the lens, and this next series of paintings I'm doing is all around about like people around campfire and around fire telling stories. And so the globes, the orbs are kind of phasing out, and I'm going into this new world of exploration. So
Oh,
it's I
that's
love it.
amazing. I can't wait to see that.
Yeah.
So do you work on many different pieces at the same time?
Generally not. Like right now, I've got I've got two. I've got that big piece and then this commission. And that's usually the most. Like I'll have a personal piece and then a commission piece that I'm working on back and forth. But I generally like to just kind of focus on one piece and like become really immersed in it. It's dangerous for me that if I spend too much time away from a painting, then I like it's like I lose the thread that I was on, that like it's like this whole journey. It's like I start on something from this inspiration and from this idea that I'm really excited. And if I don't stay with it and keep the momentum, then I start second guessing it. I'm like, was that, I don't know about that idea. And I think kind of from a bigger picture, like body of work and series of paintings is like they're all on this kind of arc, this evolution that like I'm constantly shifting and growing in my technical ability as well as like the storytelling aspects. And so like if I if I if a piece kind of falls off of that thread, then it's like hard to get it back in a way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually just thinking I've
Yeah.
got a piece that's hanging up above me here that I started a while back and was really loving it, like made it and didn't finish it. And then it just sat there. And every time I came up to it, I was like, I'm not, no. It just like nothing was right. And often with this last piece that I did, this really big one, I've worked on it consistently every day, sometimes for just 10 minutes and sometimes for a couple of hours, but it was a very fluid, easy. I was
Yeah.
kind of I had this, it was more a feeling that I wanted to insert into it than an actual like how it looked. And it was a beautiful process. And this particular piece, it was just sitting there and I thought, you know, I don't know, maybe I'll pull it apart and turn it into something else, but it's not going anywhere. And then I was in
Hmm.
my studio, someone was coming to take some photos of some of the pieces that I have. And I started, because she wanted me kind of doing something with my hands. And I started working on this piece. And because I was completely detached from anything, I wasn't trying to make it happen, and I just started playing and like grabbing some things, and honestly completely forgot that she was there taking photos. And I finished it within, you know, probably like 20 minutes. I just like fiddled around and I was
Yeah.
like, oh, there it is. And I
Yeah.
think there's very much, well, for me, it was very important to, in my practice and in my life, be able to just let go of the outcome. And I did this for, so I used to, when I was in, previously, I lived in Perth in Australia, and I ran these, I did full moon healing events every month. And it was like a bit of meditation, a bit of, you know, just intentionally taking that time out to take stock of the last month and just let it go. And I didn't do this in a very, there are a lot of people who do these spiritual events in a very kind of like, I call it fluffy. Like for me, it was a very practical way of like, let's get together, let's, you know, have a ritual, but it wasn't, you know, it was, yeah, it was a very tangible, practical ritual. I always had fire, because it's like, if you want to let go of something, your subconscious mind loves fire. There's something very primal
Hmm.
about it. Also, if you burn something, it's sending a very clear signal to your subconscious that you're serious about it. And so I
Yeah.
get to write something out, whatever you want to let go of, and just chuck it in the fire. And for me, I would often tell people, like, sometimes you need to let it go many times, because like, you know, these patterns and these belief systems, they can be really deep. And obviously working as a hypnotherapist, I know how deep they go. So it's not just, you know, you don't write something on a piece of paper and burn it once and then you're done for life, right?
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
intentional practice of really embodying that new version that we want to step into. And I remember one thing that I used to write down, and I did this for at least 6 months in a row. I would write down, I release my need to control the outcome. And that was
Hmm.
very broad in every aspect. It was like, I just want to make a point of not trying to micromanage everything. But what I realized later on, when I started to realize that I wanted to put art at the center of my life and the center of my business, and that that was going to become my priority, I realized that that was all leading me to being able to create art in the way that I create it. It's
Hmm.
not micromanaging, not having an expectation of needing to create a masterpiece or needing to even make something that was beautiful, but just getting lost in the process, because that's where
Hmm.
I find the magic. And
Totally.
yeah.
It's such a, it's a sticky place though, I have to admit though. I mean, I think that there's room for both of this place where like as artists we do hold on to this space of like mastery over of like aiming towards something that is greater than we could ever imagine for ourselves, whether it's like in our technical ability or ability to tell story and or whatever that is. But there's like it's like we were talking about before, like you build the skill and you're always working on building the skill, but there gets to a point where you've gotten enough skill to where you can comfortably like let go and let what wants to come through, right?
Mm.
And the reason I want to mention this is that I think sometimes that if you're too early in like your development of, and this is particular with like craft and like wanting to make things that look beautiful. I
Mhm.
think that like if too early in your development you're not taking that part seriously enough, then like you can get into a really challenging place where it's like it's you're not giving enough attention to developing those skills and too much attention to just the like letting things be as they are. And that like I think we need to kind of build that up to allow that playfulness to come
Mm.
through even more, right? It's like that, what's the saying of we need to we need to learn the rules before we can learn how to break them, essentially. It's like, you know, to understand the arena in which we play and all of the parameters within that arena, and then we can learn how to expand it. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a
And it's
lot of,
so different depending on your medium, right? Like there's so much variant there, but yeah.
I found like particularly for me, painting is really challenging me.
Hmm.
Um, I can draw, but the paint part has always, I think this was like probably started when I was a kid. As soon as I added color, I was like, oh, I've ruined it. And I used to love working with pencil, and the day I discovered graphite was one of the happiest days of my childhood. Because you can just like you can play with it so much and like do shading
Yeah,
and
yeah.
anything. But the adding of the color always just threw me off. And that's something that I've actually gone in stages of um earlier this year. I told myself, okay, I'm gonna create a portrait every day, just in a small notebook, just for the practice, so that when I get those commissions, I'm not doing like I can just do the one and I'm really comfortable with my skill. And I did fall off the wagon a couple of times and got distracted and got busy, and then I came back and I was like, so I keep on um just coming back to this discipline. But when I'm in that discipline, like the it's so interesting to see how it builds. I think
Hmm.
people don't value discipline. I mean, we live in this like era of just instant gratification. But when we actually sit down and create a skill, like I will always tell my clients, like you don't go to the gym once and get a six pack, right? If you want
Yeah,
that, you've got
yeah.
to show up and you've got to do it every day. But it really does show. Like you can do it once and be like, oh yeah, that was great. But if you do it every day, it just really it amplifies and it intensifies and you will get the results. But there is
Yeah.
that it's a dedication. And I think that that type of dedication when it comes to art, people do have that romantic idea of like you have to love it and you have to like it has to be really, it's like meditation. Like sometimes meditation is not fun. It's really not fun. You
Yeah.
sit there and you don't want
Yeah.
to be there, but you just if you do it anyway, you get the benefits for, ongoing through that day and throughout life, I feel. But there's so much resistance, I think, to actually doing that.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Oh yeah. Totally. I mean, you're speaking my language. I mean, this was another thing that I came into this world of art and picture making from this. Like I used to run my own business in construction. And so like I already had this experience of, keeping the books and like managing a team and dealing with clients and how to have something that was like on timelines and all that. And so I was able to like apply that to my art practice and create that discipline and that structure for myself, and felt like it was a bit of a superpower for me coming into the art world that I felt like a lot of artists and creatives didn't have. And but the thing that I see too, in addition to what working with artists, is that like, yeah, it starts with this like romantic notion of like, oh my, I have this vision, I'm really excited, and my paintings are going to be amazing. And then like you set to do the work, and then it's like you're like, hi, and then like off the cliff, and you're like, I have so much work to do to get to the point where I want to be as an artist in terms of like developing skills in this. And like that's where a lot of people then they're like, well, they maybe I should try something else, or like then they're kind of jumping around to figure out a different approach just to kind of keep that like that high of novelty,
yeah, yeah,
right? That like makes them like, oh, well, this is something new and exciting. And like if you can stay in that thread of the like the dark night of the soul in the valley, to like to do the work and to actually start to like develop, I think this is important, to develop skills that you feel proud of, and that like you can like actually celebrate like an accomplishment, and then like that builds momentum and like you get better and better, and then suddenly you're like, holy shit, like there is so much more I can do now with these skills. Like a whole world opens to you that you didn't even know existed before. And like that's so exciting to see people cross that bridge, and then like boom. And then it's like then like it's limitless from there.
yeah. One thing that I had to do in my personal life that I feel really affected my creativity in a positive way was to just ditch all of the other things. So I have this main body of work that's textile at the moment, and that's where I'm really crafting and creating. and I'm practicing my skills in drawing and painting, and that's like my little kind of it feels like a side hobby. But I got rid
Hmm.
of everything else that was in my studio. I had a whole bunch of clay, so I did a workshop here. There's a community center here. I did a workshop, used up all the clay, shared it with everybody. We had a couple of hours. It was fun, and then I was like, I'm done with clay. Then like just cleared out, just gifted art supplies to all different people that I knew just to get it out of my studio so that I wasn't distracted with all of these little things. Because I mean, as creatives, I don't know if you've experienced this, but for me, like I've done everything because I love making stuff. And I think because I spent a lot of my time in a career where I didn't have time. I mean, working as an interior architect, I do a lot of creative stuff, but on a computer or like in spaces, and it's not the same as actually using your hands and creating something. And I feel like
Hmm.
all of that frustration meant that I went to craft shops and art shops and bought stuff, but didn't actually use it to its full capacity. So I ended up with all of these supplies. And I see a lot of people do this. They've got a whole room or a whole cupboard full of art supplies. And I ask them, like, when's the last time you made something? And they're like, oh, I don't have the time. It's like, well, you probably do, but you're just allocating it to something else. But
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
me, to reduce the distractions, I had to just get rid of everything, like all of the supplies. And this was really painful. Like I had so much resistance to this, and it took me so long. But it was very much, I remember being in meditation one day, and it's like I felt intuitively that it's like my soul was just saying, get rid of everything. We're going big. We're doing big pieces. Don't want to waste any time doing like fiddly bits and things. And I was like, oh, and I was trying to negotiate with myself, but like, what about this, like that project that's half done? And it was like, no, 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 get rid of it all. But it took me about a year to be able to clear out my studio. And this was a few years ago, but it was really hard. But
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think what I'm trying to say is that when people end up with all of these supplies, they think that they're being creative because they're buying the supplies, but they're actually not doing the thing. And
It's
they're,
like a form of procrastination even in
yeah.
some ways. Yeah. Yeah, I completely relate. I went through a similar thing some years ago where, kind of coming from my previous career, and I was like really into woodworking
Mhm.
and other things. And like early on I played around with a lot of different styles of art, but I just got to a point where it was painful because I felt torn in all of these directions, and I wasn't able to like really give myself like and have total fidelity in a particular direction, and it was like limiting me in a lot of ways. And so I just sold like my entire woodworking shop, like all of my equipment, everything. I got rid of it. I was like it was essentially asking myself the question of like, of these things, like which one is the hell yes? What is the thing that like is like serving towards like my greatest creative expression? And it was like it was painting, and it was this very particular way of painting, and like how I wanted to do that. And so I just everything else went. And like more granular
Sounds a
than
bit
that
like the
is
process of like, choosing one person and just getting rid of all the mistresses and then
sure,
committing
sure,
to one
totally.
person.
Yeah. And this is a thing that I think artists struggle with, or I know artists struggle with a lot, which is choosing a particular direction to go. Because I think that I know I went through this phase that I felt like part of being a creative and an artist was to just be able to explore everything. And like that was just how it, but it's like it's so limiting. It's I always think of the analogy of like digging many shallow wells. It's like sure, like I want to be an oil painter, I want to be a sculptor, I want to use these mediums, or I want to play around like as an abstract artist or a realist artist or a surreal, and like we're kind of all over the map. And it's just diluting our potency to like go deep and become like really intimate with something. And I think what is good to realize is that, as we were saying even before, is like as we actually sit with something for long enough, and we can then start to see like actually how deep it can go and how like expansive it can go if like I just am picking one direction, that I can create this entire world within that space that I could spend multiple lifetimes exploring and still probably not hit the height of whatever it is that I'm capable of, you know? And so like there's so much power in like getting the clarity of like that path to walk, you know?
Yeah.
But it takes time to cultivate it, obviously, but it's I think it's worth it.
I had this interesting realization at one point that my creative process involved. So when I did the portraits, I would see someone, and it was really getting to know someone on a soul level and then drawing out their magnificence and just really showing like that beauty. That was like where I'd find inspiration. And then when I was in a stage of kind of like playing with energy and moving energy, that's when I would do acrylics on canvas. And when I felt like I'd really like was sitting in this really beautiful energy, then I would channel that energy into the fabric. That's kind of like what this cycle was for
Mm,
me. And I realized after about a year of kind of like, because I was judging myself for not picking one. And I realized, well, that's actually what I'm doing. It's how my inspiration's working. And
yeah,
I
yeah, it's all
felt like,
feeding towards that, like the
yeah,
culmination of that one. Yeah, yeah.
but the acrylic aspect of it has completely dropped away because I felt like I've accelerated that process within myself and I don't need that step anymore.
Hmm.
And it got to a point where I don't need all of the other steps. I can just be completely in that energy and channel it into the wool. But then I'll come back to the other, well, it's not easy to go traveling when you're trying to create something like the materials, it's
Sure.
bulky, right? So in order to kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
keep my creativity going, I've got these sketchbooks and that's also something that I feel challenges me, like really in terms of like the technical aspect of it. I want to grow in that way. So I've got those, but yeah, it's really interesting how all the other forms have just fallen away. And I will, even if I'm have the opportunity to create in a certain way again, I feel like I'm so satisfied with the work that I'm doing that feels really aligned for me that I don't need to kind of get distracted with the little things anymore. And
Yeah.
I think it was a great realization for me because a few years ago I didn't think I would be capable of that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, I love hearing that. And it's such a good reminder too that for people listening in on this that are like maybe they're at like a beginning or earlier stage and like what they're trying to say or how they want to create things is that like is to give yourself the space and to be patient to like let things develop, right? Because again, you know, we're in such a hurry and we want to just like get the results and like be there at the end. Or we see artists like on social media and it's like you know the story, the reality of like that trajectory is so skewed and like people don't understand like what it takes in order to get to these places to be creating work that you feel really proud of that like that and you're able to like be living into effortlessly or seemingly effortless. It just takes time. It just takes time and you know patience is such a huge thing in this whole world.
Yes, yes, it is. Oh, I'm cultivating patience. It's never been my forte, but I'm noticing, I think more recently, like moving to this part of the world where I am now, and I'm in a very remote part of the tropical part of Australia, right at the top in the Northern Territory. It's the real land of Crocodile Dundee. Around here, there's crocodiles and there's, it's a bit, it's very much the outback. But
Hmm.
it was such a beautiful gift for me on a soul level, on a creative level, and on a human level to actually just move away completely from my life as it was and have the spaciousness to just start from scratch and to not actually have that many options that I have to really go deep within my creativity, but have all of the
Hmm.
inspiration. The land here is incredibly creative, just walking out in nature and there's something really potent about the energy here. Yeah, and I think we often don't have the luxury of doing this. Like I think it's not a luxury I would have created if it wasn't imposed upon me. But in hindsight, I'm very
Yeah.
grateful for the development that I've been able to have through that. Um,
Yeah,
Again,
well, and it's
move through the resistance, you find the gift.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it's also, I think it's one of the benefits of the digital era that we find ourselves in as artists. Whereas, when I was first starting, it was such a big thing to like the location that you existed in as an artist in terms of like getting your career going and like getting access to galleries and to the community of arts. And like it's like, oh, well, you got to live in New York or you got to live here. Like this is where you go to be an artist, or you have to live in some major metropolitan area. And I'm so grateful that I can essentially live wherever the heck I want and not have to worry about that. Like I can be rural and know that I can still share the work that I do with the world and be able to get access to that. And so that is one benefit, that I can live here in this like small corner of the Pacific Northwest and be in the woods every day and don't have to live in a city. So
Yeah, that's amazing.
yeah.
Christopher, I could spend the whole day talking with you, but I'm mindful of time. Thanks so much for your time today. Thanks for
Oh,
inviting
it's my pleasure. That was a
my
great,
audience into your
great
studio.
conversation.
And
Yeah.
look forward to connecting with you further. I'll put all of your links in the notes so people can access the beautiful offerings and come and check out more of your work, because it's really sensational. It's worth seeing and sharing. So thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And yeah, look forward to staying in touch. And yeah, again, that was a great conversation. So happy to have it again anytime.
Yeah. Thank you for tuning in to this creative conversation in the heARTscaping studio. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world if you could take a moment to like, comment, maybe even share with a friend who could benefit from this content. And if you would like to share more time in the studio with me as I discuss all things creativity, mindset, and empowerment, then please consider subscribing to my channel. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye for now.